On the 14th of September, 1923, at the edge of a nameless tributary somewhere east of the Upper Kapuas in central Borneo, a 15-year-old boy named Soren Mattis stood barefoot in red mud and watched the last of the expedition canoes round the bend and disappear. There had been no ceremony. Halford, the expedition leader, had simply pointed at the bank and said, "Off you go, lad. You've slowed us enough." The three Dayak porters averted their eyes. Davies, the cartographer, pressed his lips together, but said nothing. Only Jennings, the supply clerk, bothered to laugh. "Leave him the cracked rice and the bad knife," Jennings called over the gunwale. "He'll come crawling back by Tuesday." A canvas sack hit the mud. Inside it, 11 pounds of rice beginning to turn, a belt knife with a hairline fracture along the spine, a tin cup, a coil of hemp rope fraying at both ends, a square of oilcloth no bigger than a tablecloth, and a box of matches wrapped in waxed paper. Nothing else. No quinine, no compass, no blanket, no second pair of boots. He had none to begin with. Soren did not shout after them. He did not sit down and weep, though the pressure behind his eyes was enormous. He picked up the sack, slung it across his shoulder, and turned to face the wall of green that rose behind the bank like a living cliff. The river smell was heavy, silt and rot, and something sweet from the flowering vines overhead. Somewhere above the canopy, a hornbill called, its wing beats slow and mechanical, like an old bellows being worked. He was alone, truly alone, and the wet season was 6 weeks away. Soren had not joined Halford's expedition by choice. He was the ward of a Methodist mission downriver in Sintang, placed there after his mother died of typhoid when he was 11. His father, a Dutch surveyor, had vanished into the interior 3 years before that and was presumed dead. The mission kept Soren fed and literate, but the headmaster regarded him as a mild inconvenience, too old to adopt out, too young to employ. When Halford's Royal Geographical Party arrived needing a porter who could read a survey chain, the headmaster volunteered the boy before breakfast. For 7 weeks, Soren had carried loads, cleaned instruments, cooked rice, and said almost nothing. He watched everything. He noticed that the Dayak porters built their overnight shelters on stilts, never flat on the ground. He noticed the way they tested bamboo by tapping it with the back of a knife. A dull sound meant rot inside. He noticed that they angled their thatch steep, nearly 60 degrees, so the rain slid off in sheets rather than soaking through. He asked questions when no one else was listening, and the eldest porter, a quiet man named Buang, answered them with the patience of someone who recognized a careful mind. None of this mattered to Halford, who saw only a thin boy who walked too slowly uphill and asked too many questions about drainage. Now, standing at the river's edge, with the current pulling south and the canopy pulling north, Soren did the first thing Buang had taught him. He sat down, looked, and waited. For 20 minutes, he watched the water. The river here ran east to west, brown and steady, about 40 yards across. On the far side, low swamp forest with standing water between the root buttresses, no good for building. On his side, the bank rose sharply for about 12 feet, then leveled into denser jungle. To his left, maybe 200 yards upstream, a spur of pale limestone jutted out of the hillside like the prow of a buried ship. Ferns cascaded down its face, and at its base, the ground was noticeably drier. Limestone meant drainage. It meant a surface that didn't hold water the way clay did. It also meant a windbreak. That spur would deflect the river gales that came before the big rains. He stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked toward the ridge. The first 3 days were pure labor and little sleep. He cleared a platform area against the limestone face, 10 feet by 6, working with the cracked knife and a flat river stone he used as a mallet. He cut bamboo from a dense stand 40 yards east, selecting only the stalks that rang high and clear when tapped, Buang's test. He split them with controlled strikes, cursing softly each time the knife's fracture line widened by another hair. The platform came first, 4 stout bamboo posts, each buried 2 feet into the soil and braced with stones at the base, lifting the floor 5 feet above the ground. Halford's men had built their camp beds at 2 feet. The Dayak porters built theirs at 4. Soren chose 5, and he chose it for reasons no one on the expedition would have understood. He had watched the river. On the 3rd evening at camp, weeks ago, he had noticed a faint brown stain on the limestone 6 feet above the current waterline, the mark of a previous flood. If the river could rise 6 feet, it could rise 7, and if something drove the water higher still, he wanted to be above it, 5 feet of clearance beneath the floor. It seemed excessive. Jennings would have laughed. Davies might have frowned and called it overbuilt. But Soren lashed the crossbeams tight, used bamboo pins instead of relying solely on vine cordage, and left narrow gaps, about 2 inches, between the floor slats. Air would rise through those gaps. Rain could drain. He could see the ground below. He built the roof frame at a steep pitch, 60 degrees on both sides, exactly as the Dayak shelters had been angled. He thatched it with broad palm fronds, layering them from the bottom up, so each leaf overlapped the one below like fish scales. The rear of the shelter pressed against the limestone wall, which provided a solid, dry backstop and a surface that stayed cool even at midday. On the 4th morning, he lit a small fire on the ground beneath the platform, not for warmth, but for information. He watched the smoke. It drifted northeast, pulled by a natural draft that ran along the limestone face. He repositioned his fire pit to channel smoke away from his sleeping area, using a shallow trench dug with a flat stone. Insects avoided the drift. The air above the platform, filtered through the gaps and pushed gently by the ridge's convection, moved steadily. It was crude. The lashings were uneven. The thatch had a thin spot he would need to repair. But that first night, lying on a bed of layered fern fronds 5 feet above the ground with smoke curling away below and the limestone breathing cool air against his back, Soren slept 4 unbroken hours for the first time in weeks. The jungle did not applaud his progress. It tested him. On day 6, something got into his rice. He had hung the sack from a crossbeam, but a palm civet, he found the tracks in the soft earth below, had climbed the post during the night, torn through the canvas with its teeth, and eaten or scattered nearly 2 pounds. 11 pounds became 9. 9 would last perhaps 3 weeks if he rationed carefully, less if he ate enough to keep his strength for building. He rebuilt the food cache. This time, he used the oilcloth as a wrap, suspended the bundle from a horizontal bamboo pole between 2 posts, and fitted each post with a wide disc cut from a soft log, a baffle, too broad and too slippery for a civet's paws to pass. He tested it by shaking the pole. The discs held. The food hung free, untouchable from below. On day 9, the knife cracked further. The fracture now ran 2/3 across the spine. He could no longer strike hard. Every cut became a careful, shallow motion. Score, bend, snap, score again. He compensated by making a bamboo wedge and a stone scraper, crude tools that could handle rough splitting while the knife was reserved for precision work. Every evening, he checked the blade by firelight, pressing his thumbnail against the fracture line to feel whether it had grown. On day 14. A storm arrived without warning. A squall line that hit the canopy like a wall of sound and drove rain horizontally for 3 hours. Water cascaded down the limestone face and pooled at the base. His drainage trench overflowed. The wind, funneled between the ridge and the nearest large trees, caught the roof frame and wrenched 2 lashing points loose. The entire right side of the thatch lifted, flapped, and tore. Rain flooded the platform. He spent the night huddled in the corner where the limestone overhang gave him 4 square feet of dry space, holding the oilcloth over his rice like a man shielding a child. By morning, he surveyed the damage with hands that shook, not from cold, but from the particular exhaustion of a body that has been clenched tight for hours. The shelter was wrecked on one side. The fire pit was a lake of ash. 2 of his 4 bamboo water tubes had blown off their resting forks and cracked on the rocks below. Soren sat on the edge of his platform, feet dangling above the puddled earth, and stared at the damage. He could rebuild. He would rebuild. But the storm had shown him that his design was wrong in 2 places. The lashing points needed to be doubled, and the roof needed a center ridge beam thick enough to anchor against lateral wind, not just shed vertical rain. He spent 4 days rebuilding. The new roof had 8 lashing points instead of 4, each using a cross hitch that Buang had shown him for river raft construction, a knot that tightened under load rather than loosening. The ridge beam was a length of ironwood he found fallen near the river, so dense it barely floated. He dragged it up the slope on a track of bamboo rollers, carved notches for the rafters, and pegged everything with hardwood pins. When the next squall came, 5 days later, the shelter held. He lay awake, listening to rain hammer the thatch, and watched water run cleanly down both sides while the floor stayed dry. The gaps in the bamboo floor let the air circulate. The limestone at his back was cool and solid. The smoke trench below carried the last of his evening fire's embers safely away. He carved a mark into the stone, a single vertical line. 1 month. The rice ran low by the end of the 4th week. Soren had supplemented it with river snails, which he boiled in his tin cup over coals, and with the starchy pith of a sago palm he found in the swamp forest across the river. Crossing took nerve. He built a crude bamboo raft, 3 poles lashed abreast, and poled himself across at the shallowest point. The sago was abundant, but labor-intensive. He had to fell a section of trunk, scrape the pith, wash it repeatedly in his tin cup, and dry the resulting starch on hot stones. A full day's work produced enough starch to last 3 days. He found wild ginger along the bank and turmeric growing in the shaded loam near the limestone. Both were mild medicines as well as food. Buang had told him that turmeric paste could be pressed against a cut to slow infection. He tested this on a shallow gash on his left forearm where a split bamboo edge had caught him. The wound closed cleanly in 5 days. He began keeping records. With a stick of charcoal and smooth patches of limestone, he scratched a daily log: river height, wind direction, rain duration, temperature guesses based on his own comfort. Each morning, he walked to the bank and checked the water against a series of notches he had carved into a flat stone at the waterline. The river rose and fell by as much as a foot in a single day during the transitional weeks before the wet season. He recorded every change. He did not know then that this habit would save his life. October arrived in a curtain of warm rain that did not stop. The wet season came not in dramatic storms, but in a steady, suffocating downpour that lasted days. The canopy dripped constantly. The air was so humid that his oilcloth grew slick with condensation. Mold appeared on his thatch within a week. gray spots that spread like slow fire. He scraped them off with his stone tool and rubbed the affected fronds with wood ash, which slowed the rot. He replaced the worst sections with fresh palm leaves, keeping a rotation of drying fronds hanging under the rear overhang where the limestone kept them out of the direct rain. The river rose, slowly at first, half a foot in 2 days, then faster. By the 5th day of continuous rain, the water had climbed past his 4th notch, 4 feet above the dry season line. By the 8th day, it reached his 5th notch, 5 feet. The swamp forest across the river vanished beneath a sheet of brown water. Logs and mats of vegetation drifted past. The air smelled of torn roots and disturbed mud. Soren moved everything he owned to the highest point of his platform. The rice, now down to its final 3 pounds, the sago starch in a bark container, the ginger and turmeric wrapped in leaves, the knife wrapped in oilcloth, the remaining rope, the matches. He hung the food bundle from the highest crossbeam, nearly touching the underside of the roof. He lashed his water tubes vertically to the posts, openings tilted upward to catch rain. On the 9th night, the river reached his 6th notch. 6 feet above the dry season line, the brown stain on the limestone, the old flood mark he had noticed that first afternoon, was now under water. He was above the old record, and the rain was still falling. He slept that night with his body pressed against the limestone wall, the cool stone steadying him. The platform was solid, the ironwood ridge beam and the doubled lashings held without complaint. But the sound of water below was continuous, a low rushing murmur that seemed to vibrate through the bamboo. He dreamed of the river entering the forest, spreading silently between the trees, rising toward him in the dark. He woke to a sound he had never heard before. It was not the rain, which had eased to a thin drizzle. It was not the river, which still murmured below but no longer roared. It was a dry, sliding, rustling sound, like a dozen ropes being dragged slowly across bark. It came from directly beneath him. Soren lay perfectly still. His eyes were open. The pre-dawn light was gray and flat, turning everything to shades of lead. He could see the gaps between his floor slats, those 2-inch spaces he had insisted on, the ones that let air circulate upward and let him see the ground. He looked down. The ground was moving. For a moment, his mind could not organize what he saw. Shapes in the half-dark, sliding across each other, wet and gleaming. Then his eyes adjusted, and his stomach dropped straight through the floor. Snakes, dozens of them, perhaps more, coiled and winding across the earth beneath his platform in a slow, tangled mass. Some were as thin as his finger, quick and darting. Others were as thick as his wrist, moving with the heavy, deliberate patience of creatures that had all the time in the world. Their scales caught the faint light in dull flashes, brown, olive, a yellowish cream banded with black. He recognized the banding. Buang had pointed one out on the river trail during the 2nd week of the expedition, stepping carefully around it and telling Soren its Dayak name, which meant Night Sister, a Bornean crate. Its venom attacked the nerves. A man bitten at night might not wake by morning, and there were more than crates. A broader shape near the base of his leftmost post was a pit viper. He could see the wedge-shaped head and the heat-sensing pits even in the dimness. Others he could not identify. It did not matter. The ground beneath him had become a carpet of venom, and he was lying 5 feet above it on a bamboo platform with 2-inch gaps. They had come up from the river. The flood had driven them out of their burrows, their rock crevices, their root hollows, and they had moved uphill in the dark, seeking dry ground. The base, of the limestone ridge. His ridge, the place he had chosen for its drainage and its coolness, was the highest dry ground for a quarter-mile in any direction. Every snake in the floodplain had the same idea he'd had. Soren's breath was shallow and fast. He pressed his palms flat against the bamboo floor, willing himself not to shift his weight. The platform was solid. The gaps were too narrow for anything but the smallest snakes to pass through. His food hung from the highest beam, untouchable. His knife was beside his head, wrapped in oilcloth. His body was entirely above the floor. Nothing dangled. All the choices they had laughed at. The 5-foot elevation when 2 would have seemed enough. The gaps in the floor that Jennings would have called sloppy building. The hanging food cache. The limestone backstop that kept the rear of his platform tight against solid rock, leaving no gap for anything to climb up behind him. He lay still and counted his breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow and steady, the way Buang had breathed when the expedition canoe hit rapids and everyone else was shouting. Soren counted to 100, then again, then again. The light changed. The drizzle stopped. Dawn came in stages, gray to pearl to a faint gold that filtered through the canopy in long, angled shafts. The snakes below began to move differently, some sliding away toward deeper cover as the temperature shifted. A crate disappeared into a crevice at the base of the limestone. The pit viper uncoiled and flowed like dark water toward the tree line. By mid-morning, most were gone. Not all. A few remained in the cool shadow directly beneath his platform, coiled in the depressions where the soil was still damp. Soren waited until the sun had moved past noon and the temperature beneath the platform rose enough to make even the shade uncomfortable for cold-blooded creatures. Then, one by one, the last of them slid away into the forest. He did not move until the ground was clear. Even then, he waited another full hour, listening for the whisper of scales on soil, watching the shadows beneath the platform for any trace of movement. The air warmed. Insects returned to the clearing, a good sign. A blue-winged dragonfly settled on the edge of his floor and cleaned its eyes with tiny, precise legs. Life was resuming its ordinary pace. Then he climbed down on the side closest to the limestone wall, checking every handhold twice, placing each foot with the slow deliberation of a man crossing a frozen lake. He stood on solid earth with his legs trembling so badly he had to lean against the rock face for several minutes, pressing his forehead against the cool stone until his breathing slowed. He was alive. His hut, the crude, overbuilt, gap-floored, too-tall platform that no one from the expedition would have approved, had held him above a flood of water and a flood of venom, and it had done so because every piece of it had been built to answer a question rather than follow a convention. He carved a second mark into the limestone. Not a line this time. A small diamond shape, the sign Buang used for a dangerous crossing safely completed. 3 weeks later, a trading canoe came up the tributary. 2 men from a Dutch logging concern, checking water levels for the post-monsoon timber run. They found Soren sitting on his platform, clean and composed, with a fire burning in his redesigned pit and a rack of smoked fish drying above the coals. His rice was gone, but he had found a stand of wild breadfruit on higher ground and had been roasting the starchy seeds on hot stones. The traders stared at the shelter. One of them, an older Malay named Hassan, who had spent 30 years on Borneo rivers, walked around it slowly, examining the lashings, the baffle discs, the thatch angles, the drainage trench, and the smoke channel. He looked at the carved flood marks on the limestone. He looked at the gaps in the floor, Then he looked at Soren. "How old are you?" he asked. 15. Hassan was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "You build like a riverman, like somebody who listens to the water." He offered Soren a ride downriver to Sintang. Soren thought about it. The mission was there. A bed, cooked food, the headmaster's indifference, which was at least not cruel. "Could I stay?" he asked. Not to Hassan, to himself almost. "Could I stay and build it better?" Hassan studied him with dark, calm eyes. "The water will come again next year." "I know. I'll be ready." Hassan reached into his canoe and handed Soren a new parang, a broad jungle knife with a hardwood handle and a blade that rang like a bell when tapped. "A man who builds above the flood line," Hassan said, "should have a blade that doesn't crack." He also left a sack of rice, a tin of salt, a coil of good rope, and a jar of kerosene for waterproofing lashings. Then he and his partner poled away downstream, and Soren was alone again. But the solitude felt different now. It had edges he understood. He stayed. Through the second wet season, he improved the shelter. He added a second level, a storage platform beneath the main floor 3 feet up. Protected by baffles and accessible by a bamboo ladder, he could pull up at night. He extended the roof overhang by 4 feet on the windward side, creating a dry workspace where he could scrape sago, sharpen tools, and mend lashings without getting soaked. He dug a proper drainage channel around the limestone base, lined it with flat stones, and directed the overflow into a natural gully that fed back to the river. He built a rain catchment system from split bamboo gutters that channeled roof water into a sealed bamboo cistern, giving him clean drinking water that didn't require boiling during the heaviest rains when firewood was too wet to burn. When the floods came again, higher than the year before, the snakes came too. But this time, Soren had sealed the 2-inch floor gaps with woven palm strips that could be opened in dry weather for ventilation and closed tight when the river rose. He lay on his platform and listened to them pass below, the dry whisper of scales on stone, and his heartbeat stayed steady. Word spread along the river. Hassan mentioned the boy at the trading post, a Dutch surveyor, not Soren's father, though the boy's heart jumped and fell when he heard, came upriver to see the flood marks and the shelter. He brought a proper field journal, a pencil, and a small thermometer. "Keep recording," he told Soren. "Everything you write down about this river, the levels, the timing, the speed of rise. No one else has this. You're the only observer on this stretch of water." Soren filled that journal in 8 months. Hassan brought him another. By the time Soren was 19, the shelter had become a way station. River traders stopped to check water conditions. A Dayak family displaced by a logging dispute camped nearby for a season, and Soren helped them build a raised platform using the techniques he had refined: the double hitch lashings, the ironwood ridge beams, the smoke channels, the baffled food caches. The father, a man named Aaron, taught Soren in return how to read termite trails to find dry wood, how to weave rattan into baskets tight enough to carry water, how to tap rubber from wild trees without killing them. Aaron's daughter, Naya, was 16, quiet, watchful, quick with a blade, and entirely unimpressed by Soren's reputation among the river traders. She corrected his rattan weaving without apology and showed him a method of smoking fish that kept them edible for weeks longer than his technique. "You build well," she told him one evening, examining the joinery on his storage platform. "But you store badly. Too much weight on one beam." He fixed it the next morning. Their friendship was a working partnership, a shared language of observation and craft. She noticed things he missed. He drew plans, she improved. When the family moved on at the end of the dry season, Naya left behind a coil of her best rattan cordage and a promise to return. Halford's expedition, meanwhile, had ended badly. The party reached the headwaters of the Kapuas, but found no route to the east coast. 2 men fell ill with malaria. Halford himself contracted dysentery and had to be carried downriver on a litter. Davies, the cartographer, published a report in London that was politely received and quietly shelved. Jennings, the supply clerk who had thrown Soren's canvas sack into the mud, was dismissed for falsifying inventory records and was last seen working a rubber plantation near Pontianak, bitter and broke. None of them knew about the boy they had left behind. None of them knew that his flood records, passed from Hassan to the surveyor and eventually to the Colonial Water Authority, would become the baseline data set for river management on the upper Kapuas tributaries for the next 20 years. Soren lived on the ridge for the rest of his life. He married Naya when he was 23, and she was 20. They built a proper house, still raised, still angled, still breathable, and raised 4 children who grew up knowing the river's moods, the way city children know the names of streets. The eldest became a teacher in Sintang. The second studied forestry in Batavia. The twins stayed on the river, guiding survey teams and maintaining the way station network their father had begun. Soren's flood journals filled an entire shelf. Visiting hydrologists in the 1940s found his data remarkably accurate. His hand-carved stone gauges had recorded water levels that matched within inches the readings taken by modern instruments decades later. His notes on seasonal timing, animal behavior before floods, and the relationship between upstream rainfall and downstream rise were cited in a 1951 Dutch colonial water management report as the most complete riparian observation record in central Borneo. He never sought out Halford or Jennings or anyone from the expedition. He never wrote letters of accusation. He did not need to. The shelter stood. The records spoke. The river knew his name in the only language that mattered, the language of measurement, patience, and care. Soren Mattis died on the 11th of March, 1974, aged 66. He was sitting on the platform of the original shelter, rebuilt 3 times but always on the same posts, always against the same limestone face. When his heart stopped, Naya was beside him. The river was low, running clear over brownstones, and the late afternoon light came through the canopy in long golden columns that touched the water and turned it briefly to amber. His last words, spoken to his youngest grandson that morning, were not dramatic. The boy had been struggling to level a bamboo crossbeam and had grown frustrated, striking the joint harder and harder. "Slow down," Soren told him. "Look at the grain. The bamboo already knows which way it wants to go. Your job is to find that out." The boy stopped, looked, found the natural curve, set the beam clean on the first try. Soren smiled and said nothing more. The ridge still stands above the tributary, though the jungle has thickened around it, and the nearest logging road is still a hard day's walk through secondary growth. The limestone face is weathered now, softened by decades of rain and creeping moss. But if you scrape the green away from a flat section about 5 feet above the current waterline, a section where the stone is slightly smoother than its surroundings, as though touched by many hands, you can still find them. A row of vertical lines, each one a month survived, and among them a small diamond shape, the mark of a dangerous crossing safely completed. The river rises every year, as it always has. The floods come. The snakes seek high ground, driven by the same ancient logic that drove them on that October night in 1923. And the old shelter's bones ironwood and stone and bamboo that has been replaced 100 times by hands that learned from hands that learned from his, still hold, still breathe cool air against the limestone, still stand exactly high enough. The jungle punished hurry, but it rewarded attention. Soren Mattis learned this at 15, alone and abandoned at the edge of a world that wanted to swallow him whole. He spent the rest of his life proving it true, not with words, but with the quiet testimony of a structure that stood,